Drawn and quartered by Jack Olick. Narrated by Chris Harvey. The artist's smiling, sunburned face swam vaguely before Critchett, so that he brushed a hand over his eyes, not recollecting for the moment where he was. Then, remembering, his own face went stiff. The artist's smile was as derisive as his own had been earlier. The artist, enjoying his discomfiture, lit a cigarette and tossed his dead match on the table. "And are you neat and tidy?" "No more than any other man." Ill at ease, Critchett picked up the dead match and dropped it into an ashtray, and was unaware that the unconscious gesture made the artist smile the wider. He was no longer thinking of the artist in any case. And yet what? Rogers at least was not smiling. Critchett shrugged. This was all nonsense. "Oh, it's nothing, it's just a recurrent dream." But why that one? The artist, tenacious, clung to his advantage. Why that particular nightmare? Blast the man. He was being deliberately obnoxious. Critchett's temper, controlled though it was, sounded in his voice. "Now, it's not my nightmare, is it, that you're really concerned about? It's yours, isn't it?" So venomously was it said that the artist recoiled, but it was Critchett's turn now to be tenacious. "What about your story, eh?" "My story?" The artist spoke under his breath, hesitantly, as though marshalling his thoughts, and those thoughts mirrored themselves in his eyes. His eyes were suddenly hard. "Mine begins on an island, a tropical island, the island of Haiti." Each thud of the distant drum seemed to Moore to be an exclamation point, accenting the bitterness that, despite all his efforts, persisted in permeating his thoughts. Usually the drum sounded only after dark, but this time it had begun early in the morning and continued throughout the day, a faint but insistent beat that whispered of the black magic and the macabre voodoo rituals that visitors to Haiti so avidly sought and so rarely found. Frowning, he cocked an ear toward the far-off booming, annoyance momentarily replacing his concentration, and he set down his brush and palette. Just outside the door of the hut he listened again, ignoring the perfume of wild orange and lemon trees and the other ranker smells of the jungle that assailed his nostrils. Once, when he had first arrived in Haiti, he had been fascinated by its smells and by the strangeness of it, but that had been before he had settled in the jungle. He was more aware now of the mosquitoes and the scorpions and the spiders and the blowflies that made life here an agony. His hut was only a few miles from the outskirts of Port-au-Prince, a city as jammed with humanity as any white man's metropolis, but it might as well have been on the moon. When the drum fell suddenly silent, he paused for a moment to stare at the hut in disgust. Set down in a small clearing, the hut was at once his haven and his private hell, his studio and his prison. From the outside, except for the empty food tins that he had carelessly scattered everywhere, it resembled any other native dwelling. Palm-roofed with walls of interwoven branches and vines, it made a perfect hiding place for rats and for 100 varieties of Haitian vermin. Inside it was littered, sparsely furnished, with a rickety table, a chair, a cot, and a few shelves, but inside at least there were traces of colour to relieve the jungle's interminable green. The paintings that he had done leaned against the leafy walls of the hut, glowing. Moore ignored them. It was the painting on the easel in the centre of the hut, a self-portrait that drew him back inside. His brush had caught exactly the bitterness in his eyes and the tight lines of his mouth, and when he had contemplated the portrait critically for a while, he nodded. Imbued with sudden new impetus, he studied his face in the mirror that he had set up beside the easel and began to work quickly and surely. The portrait was good, damn good, and all his old-time fascination with his craft, all the old-time enthusiasm came flooding back so that he forgot time, forgot where he was, until at last the light began to fail and he stepped back from the easel to study what he had done. Another touch of the brush set a tiny highlight in precisely the proper place. Almost finished. He had stepped back again and he spoke aloud. Paint-stained and unshaven, lonely and isolated, he had fallen easily into the habit of holding one-sided conversations with himself, and he was not even aware of his own voice. My best piece of work. But if he was not aware of his voice, he could not ignore the thoughts that came crowding in on him. His face twisted, became a grim mask. When he flung his palette onto the table, the gesture was only a small indication of the helpless anger that so rarely left him in peace. What's the use? It'll be laughed at and criticised, considered worthless, like all my work. His expression changed, became almost savage as he stepped toward the painting, but the small palette knife that he picked from the table as he moved forward remained unused. Someone, a man, had appeared at the open door of the hut and was watching him curiously. A man who looked vaguely familiar and completely out of place in his well-cut sports clothing and highly polished shoes. "Well, don't you recognise me, Frank?" The man's voice, too, was vaguely familiar. Something clicked in Moore's brain, and he had a momentary mental picture of an art show held an eternity ago in London, of cocktails and sleek art patrons. Of course! Bob Dixon! Dixon had been the owner of the gallery where the show had taken place, and they had met and liked each other and seen a great deal of each other before circumstances intervened to keep them apart. "But what are you doing here?" "Well, I had some business in Port-au-Prince and heard your name mentioned in a bar." Dixon was staring at him with only partially concealed wonder. Moore bore little resemblance to the eager young artist he had known in London. "Well, may I come in?" "Of course." Inside, not bothering now to conceal his curiosity, Dixon looked around, puzzled. "Oh, it's strange to find you out here. Any special reason? I thought you'd be in the south of France, rolling in the money." "Money?" Now it was Moore's turn to be puzzled. "Well, I've been here for quite a while. I tried living in the city for a time, but with what little cash I had, it didn't last very long. Where would I get money?" "Well, your paintings. I saw one sold a few weeks ago. It brought £5,000. If that isn't money, well, what is?" "5,000?" Moore's voice was a gasp. "One of my paintings?" His mind wrestled with the information, could not quite grasp its import. "Well, sold by whom?" "Why, Arthur Gaskell. He sold it at his gallery on behalf of Lawrence Dilton." At a mention of the names, the bitterness in Moore's eyes deepened, but what he had heard still made no sense. There had to be more to what Dixon was telling him. "But why such a price?" "Why, you don't know?" Dixon was honestly astonished. "Why, your pictures have been highly praised lately by no less an art critic than Fenton Breedley. You're quite the rage these days." "Fenton? Fenton?" Moore's bitterness was suddenly alive, writhing across his face, naked and ugly. Yet somehow he managed to control himself. "Do you know why I came out here?" "Well, no, I'm afraid not." "Why did you?" Moore's bitterness broke free, spilled over. When he spoke, it was through his teeth. 3 reasons. You just mentioned them all. It was Fenton Breedley, the art critic, who said my work was worthless, who convinced the world that I was an amateur. It was Arthur Gaskell, the art dealer, who said he couldn't sell any of my pictures. And so kind-hearted Lawrence Dilton, the famous art collector, bought up every painting I had in my studio, cheaply, just to do me a favour. He gave me just enough money to come here, buy some paints and canvases, and start all over again. Ah, I see. Do you? The sudden intensity of Moore's words made Dixon look at him sharply. Suddenly, too, Moore was laughing, short, barking laughs that had nothing of humour in them. And all this time I've been hiding here in this hole, despising myself, trying to convince myself that I did have talent, eating my heart out because 3 experts told me that I was wasting my efforts, that my work had no value, living on canned beans, eaten alive by mosquitoes. Oh, come on, Frank. Dixon had retreated a step. Moore looked like a madman. You don't think... Why, you make it sound like a conspiracy. But Moore was not listening. Moore's eyes had slitted. His mouth had set hard. Somewhere in the jungle the drum had again taken up its insistent beat, and it seemed to be pounding in time with the angry beating of his own heart. Dixon touched his shoulder. "Frank?" "Eh?" Moore had started at the touch. "Oh, I was just thinking." "Yes? Thinking what?" "About Breedley and Gaskell and Dilton." Moore spoke the names as though they had the taste of worms. "Look, can you lend me some money? You'll get it back, and lots more, I promise you." "Why, I suppose so. I don't have much with me. How much do you need?" Another question trembled on Dixon's tongue, a question that he had no real right to ask, but that he asked anyway. "And what for?" Moore's reply was ridiculous, but it sent a chill down his spine. "To buy revenge. With voodoo." "You're joking." Moore's shrug admitted nothing, denied nothing. "Perhaps, but I still need the money. Can you let me have it?" From a pocket, Dixon produced his wallet and handed over most of its contents. "Will this do? For a start?" "Thanks. Thanks very much." "You're welcome. Now, why don't you show me what you've done since I saw you last? I'd really like to see where—" "Some other time." Moore's voice was clipped, hurried. There was no mistaking his gratitude, but neither was there any mistaking his sudden desire to be alone. "You've done me a great favour, and I appreciate it. But forgive me, but there's something I have to do, something important. I'd offer you a drink before you go if I had one to offer, but I don't know." "I understand." Dixon did not understand, but Moore had left him little choice. "Look, I'd better get going." Moore was lost in thought again. "Well, goodbye." Hurrying, suddenly eager to be gone, Dixon left the hut. There was something about Moore that was disturbing, almost frightening. Alone, in the now near complete darkness, Moore stood for a long time without moving. Unaware that he did so, he took up the palette knife from where he had dropped it on the table and fingered it until, presently, he was holding it clamped in his fist like a dagger. When he struck savagely downward, the knife penetrated deep into the wooden tabletop and remained there, quivering. The drying paint on its blade looked like drying blood. Not troubling to lock the door of the hut, he went out and walked along a trail to the dirt road that cut through the jungle not far away from the clearing, the road that had brought Dixon. But he did not follow the road in the direction that Dixon had driven, toward Port-au-Prince. His destination lay in the opposite direction. In time, when he had walked for perhaps a half-hour, he left the road and plunged again into the jungle. There was another trail here, and eventually it led him to a tiny native village, the booming of the drum growing louder in his ears as he neared the cluster of huts. In the early days, he had several times visited the village out of curiosity. This time his walk was more purposeful. Ignoring the villagers who stared at him as he passed, he walked to the hut that stood at the far end of the village street. Larger than the others, it stood alone, its entrance flanked by poles from which hung the feathered fetishes that identified it. Only a Hungan, a voodoo priest, displayed such fetishes, and the people of the village kept a respectful distance as he approached it. Even the mongrels that yapped at his heels fell back at last, as though they too were aware that this was forbidden ground. Minutes later he was seated with the Hungan on the dirt floor of the hut, sweating. Despite Haiti's eternally warm climate, a fire blazed on a crude hearth in the centre of the hut. Suspended from a tripod hung a blackened cauldron filled with some thick, boiling liquid that added clouds of steam to the already oppressive thick atmosphere. The Hungan listened to him in silence and then, still silent, poked at the fire with a stick. Fat and middle-aged, his ebony skin gleamed. He looked more like a native housewife than a sorcerer. Only his eyes hinted that he might be more than he seemed. They were sharp, alight with intelligence. "So you wish to buy voodoo?" Moore nodded. Before coming to the village he had been tense, keyed up, driven by a cold rage that blotted out everything else. Now that he was here, the beginnings of doubt had already begun to erode away his resolve. Still, he nodded. "To get revenge on the people who wronged you?" Another nod, impatient this time. They had already been over his reason for coming, but the Hungan would not be hurried. "You say you are artist. You make good pictures." What had ever possessed him to think that what he sought could be found here? "I think so." The stick that had been poking at the fire came to a halt, drew aimless symbols in the dirt floor. "Put the hand you paint with into the pot." So casually was it said, so without emphasis, that for a moment Moore did not understand. "What?" The Hungan touched the cauldron with his stick. The tip of the stick, when it touched the almost red-hot metal, sent up a small puff of smoke. "Put the hand you paint with into pot." "In there?" Moore's eyes, suddenly wide, were fixed on the thick liquid in the cauldron, a miniature volcano with molten lava seething in its depths. His head shook from side to side. No, I couldn't." Without realizing it, he had gotten to his feet and was edging back from the fire. "You want voodoo, you must do it." The Hungan was not insistent, but his eyes were twin black blades stabbing into Moore's. "I can't. I'd never be able to paint again." Moore almost turned to leave the hut, but this was insane. Whatever was in the cauldron, it would boil the flesh from his hand. Thinking that, he forgot his purpose in coming here, forgot everything except the painting that was all that he had lived for so long. The Hungan's voice made him remember. "You want revenge." The Hungan's eyes were bottomless pools in which he could see the faces of Gaskell and Breedley and Dilton. Faces that were twisted into mocking, knowing smiles that laughed at him. It was the faces that decided him, that resolved the struggle within him. To be able to wipe the sneers from those faces was worth any sacrifice, no matter how great. Aware that the Hungan was watching him, he made his decision. Suddenly, not giving himself time to think, he plunged his hand into the slowly boiling liquid. His own eyes shut and his teeth gritted against the searing pain that would surely follow. But there was no pain. Amazed, he opened his eyes and gaped down at the cauldron. The thick, lava-like substance that lapped against his skin heaved itself into small bubbles that burst and sent up small spouts of steam. But that was all. There was no sensation of heat, no shriek of protest from scalded nerve endings. Gradually, his look of stoic expectation became a look almost of arrogance. His hand, when he took it from the cauldron, had not even turned pink. "Now what? Do I get a doll to stick pins into?" The Hungan's eyes did not leave him. No. Why was it that the white men who came to him were almost always fools who pretended to scorn the very thing for which they had come? "You are artist. You can draw. You do not need doll. Now go." "Well, that's all. That's all there is to it." The Hungan did not reply. Disappointed, Moore wiped his hand on his trouser leg and dug in a pocket for the money that Dixon had given him. But the Hungan did not reach for the notes that he offered. A gesture indicated that the money was to be left on the floor. Other than that, it was as if he had already forgotten Moore. But he had not forgotten. His eyes, as he watched Moore leave the hut, were softer. He was still shaking his head sadly, almost pityingly, when Moore was gone. But Moore knew nothing of that. No longer buoyed up by the rage that had brought him, he felt like an idiot. The hate still burned in him, but his experience with the Hungan had left him empty, purposeless. Impressive as the Hungan's demonstration had been, it had not provided him with the weapon. Weary and more bitter than ever, he sought his cot later and dreamed angry dreams that left him in the morning with a sour taste in his mouth and a sense of futility that ate at him like a cancer. Not even his self-portrait could hold his interest the next day. The portrait, almost completed, needed only a few more judicious brushstrokes, but when he had applied those strokes he did not feel the surge of satisfaction that he usually felt when he had finished a painting. Aimless, he set down his palette and brush and took up a pad and pencil. But the lines that he drew on the pad were as aimless as his mood. Seeking a subject, something with which to distract himself, he began to sketch, taking for a model a chipped vase in which he sometimes stored his brushes. For a few moments the vase held his attention, and he sketched rapidly. Then that too palled. His pencil tapping on the table, he stared at the vase and past it, not really seeing it. I must have been crazy to think I could get revenge with voodoo. That thought and no other filled his mind. Still aimless, he looked down at the sketch he had drawn and wagged his head. The sketch, expert though it was, looked to him like the work of a novice. Dissatisfied, he ripped the page from the pad and tore it in half, and then in half again. Every line of his body mirrored disgust as he turned to throw the pieces into the large empty tin that stood near by his cot and that served him as a waste basket. He was an idiot. Only an idiot would waste time and money on anything as asinine as voodoo. The sudden crash behind him made him spin on his heel like a dancer, startled and alert, and with the torn pieces of paper still in his hand. The vase was no longer on the table. Somehow it had fallen to the floor, but it had not shattered. It had broken, but into 4 neatly equally sized pieces that lay now at his feet. Even the Hungan had not inspired in him the horror-tinged awe that dropped his mouth open and brought beads of perspiration to his forehead. What he was seeing was coincidence. It had to be coincidence. Or did it? His hand shaking, he lifted the 4 pieces of paper until they were level with his eyes. Each bore on its face a portion of the sketch that he had made, and each portion of the sketch exactly matched one of the 4 shards of pottery that lay on the floor. The thought that clamoured in his head was impossible, but there was a way to make certain. If voodoo really existed, he had his weapon. He could have his revenge. The thought was heady wine, but he did not give way to it. Well, not yet. Deliberately he went to the bread bin that stood on a shelf and took from it a loaf of bread that he had placed in the bin only the previous morning, and that was already edged with mould. The slice that he cut from the bread he placed on the floor. The textured whiteness of it, he was still the artist, made an interesting contrast with the hard-packed earth on which it lay. Working carefully, he made a sketch of the slice, reproducing it exactly, and when he had completed his drawing, took up an eraser. One corner of the sketch vanished as he rubbed the eraser back and forth across it. Not knowing what to expect, but eager, fascinated, he stood above the slice of bread and waited. If he was right, if there really was such a thing as voodoo, then... And there it was. He heard the rustling behind him, but he did not turn, and so he did not see the tiny twitching nose that presently poked itself out from a crevice in the wall of the hut. He had eyes only for the bread, and he did not turn even when there was a sound of scraping and a stubby grey body emerged from the crevice and moved, tentatively at first, and then with a hungry rush, toward the meal that awaited it. The first knowledge he had that he was not alone came when a huge rat, whiskers trembling, ran between his legs and pounced on the bread. "Oh, it works!" he breathed disbelievingly then, and then again as he slammed the pad exuberantly on the table. "It works!" Frightened, the rat darted away, vanished into its hole. But it had left the slice of bread. It had had time enough only to devour one corner of the white square, the same corner that Moore had so carefully erased. Bread and sketch were again a perfect match. The horror that took him again was, this time, more than a mere tinge. It gripped him like a vice, but it did not last. Awestruck as he was, he could still think, and the triumph that presently filled him wiped away the horror, wiped away everything but the thoughts that had brought him to this moment. In time, he left off staring at the bread and let his eyes wander to the self-portrait that he had only just completed. "I wonder..." He did not complete the sentence. Wondering would not dissolve away the last little pinpoint of doubt that still pricked at his brain. From among the paint tubes scattered on the table he selected one and squeezed a bit of its contents onto his palette. Bright crimson, it stood out like a real wound when he painted a small nick on one cheek of the portrait. Now he had only to wait again. Minutes ticked off, and nothing. Nothing except that he felt suddenly tired, so tired that he rubbed his eyes, yawning. He had slept badly, and the excitement of the last minutes had intensified his weariness. All at once he could not keep his eyes open. The portrait would keep. Hardly knowing that he did so, he picked up the broken vase and threw it into the waste basket, and then stretched himself on his cot. Almost instantly he was asleep. He slept for hours, until the sun had climbed across the sky and the hut was dark. But even then he did not awaken. The booming of the drum was what roused him, finally, but not all at once. At first, just after sunset, The drum sounded only softly, so that it seemed to invade his subconscious, to become a part of him, a part of the rhythm of his being. His head began to move from side to side, keeping in time with the drum beats, slowly, then faster and faster as the pace of the drumming increased, until his entire body was jerking, heaving. Lips parted, eyes wide open though he still slept, he lurched wildly, fell from the cot, and came back to full consciousness, to find that he had upset the wastebasket and that he was lying face down amid the broken fragments of the vase. It was the sharp-edged fragments of the vase, even before he felt the sharp pain in his cheek, that told him what had happened. Yet for a moment he was afraid, hesitant. It needed all his will to make him lift a hand to his face, to touch a finger to the pain in his cheek. The finger came away wet with blood. Shaking anew, he fumbled with his lantern, lit it, and then went to the mirror beside his easel. Standing stiffly, he looked from the mirror to his self-portrait, and then back again. The faces in the mirror and the portrait were identical, even to the small nick on one cheek. His fear left him, and he began to smile, and the smile, in the harsh light of the lantern, made him look like a death's head. For the rest of that night he remained awake, gloating and making plans. He had no doubts now. He had his weapon. The fates had relented at last, and now it was his turn. Only one more thing was needed to arm him completely. Money. He would need quite a large sum. But the fates had done more than merely relent. It was as if, in the space of a single day, his fortunes had made a complete about-face. In the morning, Dixon stood again in the hut and smiled at him, and dropped a thick sheaf of banknotes on the table. "I'm leaving Haiti this afternoon, so I thought—" Moore did not really care what he thought. Moore gathered up the banknotes and nodded. "This will get me back to London. Then you'll get it back. With interest. Thanks." The rest of their conversation, at least to Moore, was meaningless. Preoccupied, he was polite, no more, and Dixon eventually took his leave. And with his going, Moore held up the sheaf of notes, as though it were a sword, and breathed his words like a prayer. "At last." Three days later, wearing a new suit that fitted him only poorly, and carrying the self-portrait in a leather portfolio, he was in London. Trafalgar Square, as he crossed it, was an explosion of traffic and noise and people as familiar to him as his own hand, but he paid no attention to it. It was not out of homesickness, not out of any burning desire to see again familiar sights and hear again familiar sounds, that he had come home. The desire that burned in him was deeper than that. It was a crusade, an obsession. If he saw the crowds at all, it was only to move carefully aside as passer-by brushed against him, wary lest some damage come to the painting under his arm. At a building that fairly reeked of success and money, he paused to take a deep breath, and then went in. Minutes later, he was in a plush office, seated in a deep chair with his portfolio resting on the floor beside him, and face to face with the three men who had drawn him back across the ocean. Three men whose smug self-assurance enveloped them like an aura, who listened smiling as he talked. He talked for a long time, but the meat of all that he had to say, the gist of it, was summed up by his final sentence. You cheated me." Dilton, the collector, a millionaire many times over, and with a millionaire's easy belief in the rightness of his own actions, spoke for his companions as well as for himself. "You cheated yourself. If you had any faith in your work, you wouldn't have listened to what Fenton said about your paintings, or what Arthur said about their saleability, and you wouldn't have sold them to me for the price you did." His clipped, impatient tone dismissed any suggestion of wrongdoing, of guilt, so that Moore felt an impulse to leap at him, to smash his smug face. But softly, softly, "You know, you were all in it together." Gaskell's grin was infuriating. Ever the merchant, he spoke in the unctuous tones that had become a habit with him, and that had made his gallery one of the most successful in England, but with an inflection that was meant to sting, to hurt. "That's the way of the world. You buy cheap, you sell dear." Moore ignored the grin and let his eyes rest on Breedley, whose syndicated column and frequent television appearances could lift an artist to the heights or smash his career like a house of cards. "And pay a critic to tell lies so you can do it. No. You cheated me, all three of you, and I'm going to get revenge." "How?" Dilton, bored, made a steeple of his fingers. "With voodoo." That, whatever else they might have expected, took them by surprise. But the surprise did not last. It changed almost at once. Amused, they looked at each other and then back at Moore. Again he felt the impulse to leap up, to batter his fists against those smiling, well-barbered, self-assured faces. They were laughing at him, just as they must have been laughing behind his back even as they robbed him, just as they must have been laughing when they destroyed his dreams, when they pocketed the profits that were rightfully his. His hate rose in his throat like vomit. Damn them all. Well, let them laugh. It would not be for long. Shaking, he took up his portfolio and left the office, slamming the door hard behind him. But this blind, insane rage would not do. What he had planned would require steady hands. On the street, he stopped to compose himself. There, yeah. Better. Calm again, he hailed a cab that took him away from the bustle of the square and pulled up finally on the street that had been home to him before his departure for Haiti. The street was not as he remembered it. Tall, new apartment buildings now hemmed in the drab 4-story lodging house that was his destination, but he paid no attention. The new buildings did not concern him until he stood with the landlord of the rooming house in a studio on the top floor. The studio, still as Spartan as it had been when he left it, was bright with the sunlight admitted by a slanting skylight set into its ceiling. But even as they entered, a shadow fell across the skylight. Moore, his eyes on the skylight, hardly heard the landlord say, "Yeah, I was glad your old studio was available. It's nice to have you back." "Well, it's nice to be back." The words were the proper ones, but Moore's attitude belied them. "What's that?" "That? Oh." The landlord's eyes followed his to the skylight. "Oh, I'm afraid you'll find that things have changed quite a bit since you were last here at last." "Changed?" The landlord stepped directly under the skylight and looked up. "Well, you see for yourself." When he had himself stepped under the skylight, Moore could see what the landlord saw. One of the new buildings to which he had paid so little attention reared its height directly beside the lodging house. High above, a sign painter on a swaying scaffold concentrated on the sign that he was painting on its rear wall. It was the shadow of the scaffold that he had seen on the skylight. "Is something wrong?" The landlord had noticed his frown. No, nothing." For a moment, the sign painter had posed a possible problem, and Moore's face had reflected the thought. But another quick look reassured him. He could see the sign painter quite clearly, but there was no way in which the man could see any part of the studio except for the small space directly below the skylight. So long as he kept the work that he intended to do well away from that space, it would be invisible from above. "I sent some things. Have they arrived?" Yeah, they're all here, Governor." The landlord waved to indicate 3 easels, a small stack of blank canvases, and several cartons. "And I bought the safe exactly as you said in your letter." "Fine." Until that moment, Moore had not seen the small black safe that squatted in a corner of the room. "Well, here's the combination, Governor." The landlord handed him a slip of paper. "Whoa, thank you." "Well, welcome home, Governor." The landlord turned to the door. If you need anything, just I'll let you know." Need anything? Even now, that could bring a smile to Moore's face. Everything that he needed was right here. Everything. And when the landlord had gone, he lost no time in putting it to use. The first order of business was his self-portrait, his one prized possession. It would one day be his passport to all that he had missed. His eyes glowed with pride as he took it from the portfolio and locked it carefully away in the safe. Then the glow was replaced by a different kind of glow, a glow that only hinted at what seethed inside him. And now, from the stack of canvases he chose 3 and set them upon the easels, well away from the skylight. A few minutes later, when he had mixed his paints, he went to work. There had been other times in his life when the sheer drive of creativity had kept him at his easel for days on end, but those other times had been no more than preludes. This time it was more than creativity that drove him. Each stroke of his brush was another nail in the coffins of his enemies, and he worked, first by daylight and then by electric light, without taking time for sleep or nourishment. Fenton Breedley's portrait was first, then Gaskell's, and finally Dilton's. It took days in which to complete them, days in which his cheeks went hollow and his stomach clamoured for food, but in an amazingly short time he was done. On an evening, a week after he had begun, he could stand back and stare at the 3 completed portraits with deadly satisfaction. There was no haste to his movements when he put aside his brushes and picked up his palette knife. This was a moment to be savoured, to be enjoyed. Carrying his knife, he went to stand before the portrait of Breedley. "You saw my pictures and lied about them to the public," he said, and his voice was almost a caress. "Now, Mr. Art Critic, you'll never see another picture again." The calm that he had imposed upon himself was gone. Only his hate remained. Hate that raised his arm, that drove the palette knife through the left eye of the portrait, and then the right, that made him stab again and again, until where there had been eyes there was only shredded canvas. Panting, he stepped away from the canvas at last and felt something almost like fulfilment. Only one thing could have added an iota of pleasure to the moment. If only he could see for himself when Breedley's fate overtook him. If only he could know beyond the shadow of a doubt that he had succeeded. But he need not have been concerned. Far away, in the bedroom of a lavish apartment that overlooked Hyde Park, Fenton Breedley's eyes, the eyes that had been obliterated from his portrait, were for once placating. For once he was not the self-assured celebrity. For once he did not speak, but listened. He had been listening for some time. To his wife. A handsome, usually quiet woman. She had been raging at him for minutes, and her face was contorted, marred by the streaks of mascara that her tears had carried down her cheeks. "How long have you been seeing her?" It was not really a question. It was an accusation, flung like a stone. Trapped, Breedley said nothing. These women. He had always been able to do just about as he pleased with his wife, but she had him dead to rights. Why did you need someone else? As if there could be an adequate answer to that. She was hysterical. In a moment she would be screaming, and he detested scenes, detested tears. The smile that he gave her was meant to charm, and it made him look like a shark. Look, darling, let's be sensible about this. What I've done, well, it doesn't mean that I don't love you, but we're living in the 20th century. It was just a... She was not listening. She was beyond listening. As he spoke, he had moved forward, and she had moved back. She stood now beside her dressing table, and as he talked, her fingers were groping among the things on the table, and her face was wild. "What's that?" The bottle that she had picked up contained a colourless liquid that splashed about as she drew the stopper. It looked harmless, innocuous, and yet some instinct warned him when her arm lifted. Something shouted to him to turn away, to escape. Too late. He had only half turned when she screamed, "You'll never see another woman again, and they won't want to see you!" And she flung the contents of the bottle into his face. For an instant he felt only the coolness of it. Then, suddenly, his face was on fire. Suddenly he was shrieking in agony, his hands clasped over his eyes that were no longer there, that had bubbled for an instant and then dissolved, burned away. Suddenly acid fumes were seeping from between his fingers, and ugly red wounds were springing into being under his hands as the acid trickled down from his empty eye sockets. Eye sockets that looked exactly like the shredded, gouged-out eye sockets in the painting at which Moore stared so intently, the palette knife still gripped in his fist. Smiling his tight smile, Moore dropped the knife and moved a step to the right, there to contemplate the second of the 3 portraits that he had created. "Arthur Gaskell, art dealer, you lied to me. You told me that my pictures were worthless and that you couldn't handle them. Well, you'll never handle another, or anything else." The paint that he squeezed onto a brush a moment later was dead white. Gaskell's hands vanished from the portrait, painted out, as he applied the dead white pigment to the canvas. And at exactly the same instant, in his gallery on the other side of town, Gaskell emerged from his office into the gallery's workroom and glared at one of his employees. The employee was using the workroom's mat cutter, and he was far from expert. Several mats, ruined beyond repair, lay at his feet. Gaskell swore under his breath, No, that's not the way. You're doing it all wrong, let me show you. Sir? The cutter, you fool! That isn't the way you use it. Here, I'll show you, let me show you." Annoyed, he shoved the man aside, set a new mat on the board, and then, holding the mat in place with both hands, turned to explain the procedure. He did not see the heavy blade of the cutter slip from its latch and then slam suddenly downward. Alerted by the startled widening of the employee's eyes, he had only time enough to turn back, to open his mouth, before the blade knifed through his wrists and left him gaping at the bloody stamps where his hands had been. The pain that followed an instant later opened his mouth wider, gave birth to a blood-curdling scream. On the floor, his hands writhed once, twice, and then were still. But he did not stop screaming. Moore, miles away, could almost hear the screams. Not really, of course, but in his mind. In his mind, Gaskell's shrieks of agony made a hymn, a symphony. Chuckling, he moved to the last easel. But there was really no need to rush things. You, Mr. Dilton, can wait until tomorrow. He was still smiling his satisfied smile the next day when he went to see Dilton, his portfolio again under his arm, a pleased but not quite sated smile that remained on his face when a secretary spoke over her intercom to Dilton. Mr. Moore to see you. He didn't have an appointment. And Dilton's voice came back, tense and frightened. Show him in, then you may go to lunch. Dilton. Frightened. Dilton, whose money could buy anything on earth. Moore's smile widened and became wider still when he stepped into Dilton's office. The collector was no longer smug, no longer wrapped in his impenetrable cloak of self-assurance. He was pale, and his expression was worried, wary. It did not need the newspaper lying on his desk to make Moore aware of why, but he gestured at the paper anyway. I see that you've already read what happened to them. Not very pretty, was it? But if he had expected Dilton to cringe, to beg, he was to be disappointed. The millionaire, frightened or not, was still what he was. He waited, said nothing. It was just as well. For the moment, the fear behind his eyes was enough to keep Moore satisfied. He would break soon enough. Moore spoke slowly, distinctly. You laughed when I told you that I was going to get my revenge through voodoo. All three of you laughed. But look what happened to the other two. Don't you feel like laughing now? Still no answer. No, not even a smile. Very well, then. Gaskell and Breedley are ancient history now, in any case. So I guess it's your turn now, isn't it? There was no shaking Dilton. With a shrug, Moore reached into his portfolio. Almost in the same breath, Dilton reached into an open drawer in his desk. There was a gun in his hand when Moore looked at him again. Well, nervous, are you? Moore was grinning. Take it easy. I just want to show you something. Oh, this was delicious. Delicious. See? He had taken a painting, Dilton's portrait, from the portfolio. Remarkable likeness, wouldn't you say? Holding the portrait so that Dilton could see it, he put his free hand into his inside coat pocket and saw the collector's finger tighten on the trigger. Don't move. Why not? Moore's hand had reappeared. In it he held a slim plastic rod. It's only a pen, a red felt pen. His grin did not waver. This will interest you. Just watch me. Puzzled but still wary, Dilton stared as he drew in a red spot between the eyes of the portrait. The spot was neatly done, exactly placed in the centre of the portrait's forehead. And it was to that exact spot on his own forehead that Dilton placed the muzzle of his gun. Moore could see the struggle in him, the horrified amazement in his eyes, as his arm rose irresistibly of its own accord as the cold metal touched his skin. No, no! So much Dilton managed. Then he pulled the trigger. Clutching the portrait, Moore walked to the slumped corpse and looked down at it and began to laugh. He laughed hysterically, maniacally. Then, suddenly, he was gasping, choking. The painting fell from his hands. Livid, he clutched at his throat. He was taking in air in great gulps, but it was as if the breaths he took contained no oxygen, as if he were in a vacuum. The safe! My portrait! There's no air in there! That had to be it. Stumbling, he ran from the office. He had to get back to his studio. His life depended on it. Had he failed to find an empty cab as soon as he emerged from the building, had he been delayed even for a few moments, he would never have made it. But his luck held. The rash hour was still hours away, and the broad avenue outside the building swarmed with taxis. The driver of the one he hailed stared at him as he gasped and choked when he gave his address, but asked no questions. Not even when, from time to time, he turned to look back at Moore, and Moore's face began to turn blue, and his rasping efforts to draw air into his bursting lungs grew louder and louder. Only sheer willpower drove Moore at the end. His legs were rubber when they had reached the lodging-house at last, and he was climbing the stairs. Streaks of lightning seemed to be flashing before his eyes, blinding him, so that when he finally knelt before the safe he could barely make out the numbers penciled on the scrap of paper that the landlord had given him. It took an inordinately long time to master the combination and swing open the heavy metal door. Then, blessed relief! Life-giving oxygen flooded his lungs, drove the lightning from his eyes, wiped the squeezing, constricting pain from his chest. He could stand again, move again. Most importantly of all, he could think again. Holding the self-portrait carefully, he set it just as carefully on the easel that until today had supported the portrait of Dilton. The easel stood now just under the skylight, and a glance confirmed it. The sign painter still worked high above, but there would be no harm done, even if the sign painter did see the painting. Moore's smile of sudden recollection lit up his face. No, there would be no harm done if the sign painter saw the painting. There was nothing about this portrait to connect him with the tragedies that had overtaken Breedley and Fenton and Dilton. Dilton! He had forgotten! The portrait of Dilton that he had done still lay in Dilton's office. A portrait with a small red hole painted in its forehead that exactly matched the wound in Dilton's forehead. A portrait that would excite questions, investigations. The picture. I've got to get it before they find him. There was a chance, just a bare chance, that he could get back to Dilton's office before Dilton's secretary returned. A slim chance, but it was all he had. He was already running when he turned to the door. The stairs he took 3 at a time, hurtling down them like a projectile. He did not look back, did not look up again at the skylight. So he did not see when the sign painter stepped back to admire his work as he himself had done so often. He did not see the sign painter's foot touch the metal-capped can of turpentine that perched just on the edge of his scaffold. The can crashed through the skylight, struck the easel below, and fell with the self-portrait, bouncing as it struck so that its metal cap loosened slightly and sent a small spray of liquid into the air before it came to rest. If he had seen, Moore might have turned back even then. Instead, he ran on into the street and then out into the roadway, his eyes seeking. But a quiet residential street does not attract cab drivers. Except for a few passers-by and a few private cars, the street was empty. Desperate, he looked at his watch. There was still time. Even if he took the underground. Bent over and running with all his strength, he raced to the underground station at the corner and hurtled down the stairs. Below, the station platform was unusually crowded for this hour, but in his haste he barely noticed. Pushing and elbowing, he shoved his way to the edge of the platform and there leaned far over the tracks, straining to see along the tunnel. No train was in sight. To be so close to absolute victory, and yet so close to utter defeat, was agonizing, but there was nothing he could do. Nerves screaming, he waited. And at last, there was a distant rumble. At last, the platform under his feet vibrated, and a headlight appeared far down the black tube that was the tunnel. The train was just roaring into the station when the crowd surged forward. It flowed around him like an amoeba, pressing harder and harder, and in his eagerness he did not realise that he was being pushed closer and closer to the edge of the platform. It was not until someone's elbow punched hard against his ribs and sent him off balance that he realised what was happening and tried to recover himself. But it was no use. Suddenly he was falling, twisting in midair, so that he landed on the tracks on his hands and knees. He did not even cry out. There was just time enough for him to scramble to his feet, to think one last thought before the train was on him. Above him, someone screamed in horror, and then the onrushing metal monster took him squarely in the face and hurled him backward. He no longer had a face then. Where his face had been, there was an inchoate mass of bloody pulp, and when he came to rest, it was as if he were no more than a lifeless sack of broken sticks. It was fitting, though, that his last thought, just before the train struck him, had been what it was. Even in that moment, even as death rushed at him, he had been thinking of his revenge, thinking and wondering what had gone wrong. But how could he have understood? In the studio, his self-portrait lay on the floor, and on the portrait rested the can of turpentine that had crashed through the skylight. It had taken a little while, but enough liquid to form a small pool on the canvas had seeped at last out from under the can's loosened cap, and the results were disastrous. The turpentine had dissolved away the paint, liquefied it, so that the pigments had run together as though stirred by an idiot child. The portrait no longer had a face. What remained was an unrecognisable inchoate mass of intermingled colour that bore a sickening resemblance to bloody pulp. The club was suddenly cold as the echoing corridors above had been. Cold with the same damp cold that Rogers had felt as he waited for the elevator. "So, that's your story." Critchett, aware of the cold, chose to ignore it. "Well, we all have our little cross to bear, don't we?" His attempt to lighten the moment fell on deaf ears. The others were not amused. Trembling a little with the sudden chill, they were watching more. Critchett tried again. "Well, don't we?" The artist did not seem to have heard him. "It seems so real, almost as if it happened." "Happened? Or could happen?" Critchett's snort was interrupted by Rogers. "Mine too." Maitland nodded. "And mine." "And mine." Sebastian too had joined the chorus. All of them were deadly serious, and despite himself, Critchett was shivering. It was the cold, of course. He said, "And my story, strange as it may be, is with... it is with me all the time." For a moment he was quiet, but the thought that had begun to clamour in his head would not be still. "Do you think that our fears could be a sort of warning of some sort? Perhaps a warning of what may happen?" "Nonsense!" Rogers was again too vehement, too insistent, but no one disputed him. There was no time. Behind them there was a sound, a ping, and they turned. The pink up light above the elevator doors blinked on. It was in that moment, too, as they got to their feet, that the chairs and the table and the sporting prints and the carpet vanished. It was in that moment that the blocks that comprised the walls seemed to fuse together and became, indeed, solid slabs of concrete that glittered with tiny beads of condensation. "What the..." Maitland tried to speak and could not. "This place, It looks like a vault." Sebastian, though he managed the words, choked on them. "Where are we?" As if in reply, the doors of the elevator slid open, but not to reveal a well-lighted interior glistening with chrome. Beyond the doors there was blackness. Slowly, unwillingly, as though propelled by some will far stronger than their own, the 5 men moved toward that empty blackness and, at the doorway, stood in a tight, agonized little group and stared terrified into that emptiness, into it and beyond it, as if at something in the distance. Perhaps a minute ticked off. Then, gradually, the terror left their faces. Gradually, the fear that had etched lines in their foreheads dissipated, and their eyes took on a light of recognition. "Well, it's time to go back to our homes." Moore was the first to step into the blackness. The others, except for Critchett, followed without hesitation. Critchett stood where he was, unmoving. Only after a little while did he lift a hand, as though waving after them. He could see them quite clearly. They were walking across a landscape that was dark except for the tombstones that shone palely on all sides of them. They were in a cemetery, and when they turned to wave back at him, their faces were no longer as they had been. Their lips and noses had vanished. Their eyes were empty holes. Their skin hung in rotting ribbons, and a stench of decaying flesh drifted back to him as they turned again and went on, and then halted, each beside his own grave, and disappeared like puffs of smoke. Only Critchett remained then. Wearily he too turned, and wearily walked back into the vault. There was no one to hear, but he spoke aloud. "That's how it is, and always will be, night after night." A dry sob came into his voice. "Telling our stories every night, and each morning forgetting." His dragging feet slowed, halted. He was standing by the coffin then. The lights had gone too, but he could still see it. An old coffin that rested on a mildewed concrete base in the centre of the vault. Night after night, morning after morning, for all eternity, he moved on, closer to the coffin, stood by it, and vanished as the others had vanished. The little that was left of him rested in the coffin, ugly and unmourned. And he never knew when the sun rose and lit up the weather-beaten exterior of the vault, when it squatted amid the other graves in the cemetery. And so it would be, night after night, after night, after night. The Vault of Horror was written by Jack Olek and narrated, sound edited, mixed and produced by Chris Harvey.